The other day, I made a video going over my pick for the best contract currently from all 32 NHL teams, so now I feel like it's only right that I do the same thing, but instead of picking out the best contract for every team, we pick out the worst. Same rules that applied for that video are going to apply for this one. No ELCs. Players must at least be signed through next season, and we're not going to be including guys that are on LTIR and will likely never play again, guys like Price and Weber for an example. If this is your first time coming across the channel and you want more NHL content just like this all throughout the year, hit that subscribe button. We're getting super close to 77,000. So with that all being said, let's go ahead and kick things off with the Anaheim Ducks, and my pick for their worst contract is going to be Alex Killorn. I don't think it's awful. 3 more years at 6.25 mil. He scored 18 goals this past season in his first season with the Ducks in just 63 games, so over a 20-goal pace. Anaheim is projected to have over 30 mil in cap space heading into this year's offseason. They don't really have a lot of big money long-term contracts, so it's kind of hard to pick out a bad deal. I feel like it had to be between Gudas or Killorn, and I decided to go with Killorn. The Boston Bruins are up next, and my pick for their worst contract is definitely going to be Andrew Peeke, a player who they acquired at the most recent NHL trade deadline, a deal that was a bit of a head-scratcher for me. Peeke has 2 more seasons at a cap hit of 2.75 mil per. He played third pairing minutes down the stretch towards the end of the regular season for the Boston Bruins. Only appeared in 6 playoff games where he was playing under 15 minutes a night. I guess with Peeke being 26 years old and, being a right shot, having 2 more years left on his deal, Boston probably views him as a full-time member of the Blue Line next season. The worst contract currently on the Buffalo Sabres has to be Jeff Skinner, still 3 more years at a cap hit of $9 million per season. There was a period of time there for a minute where this looked like probably the worst contract in the entire NHL. In Skinner's first 2 seasons after signing this massive extension with the Sabres, he was only able to muster up 21 goals in 112 games. Luckily for the Buffalo Sabres, he was able to bounce back with a couple of 30-plus goal seasons and still finished with 24 this season. A fine player, but definitely not worth anywhere close to 9 mil per season. Next up, we have the Calgary Flames, and this is an easy one. It has to be Jonathan Huberdeau. 7 more seasons at a cap hit of $10.5 million. Not only is this the worst contract currently on the Flames, I think it has to be in the conversation for worst contract in the entire league. It has been a very rough transition thus far for Jonathan Huberdeau going from Florida to Calgary. He set an NHL record for the largest season-to-season point drop-off from 115 points in his final season with the Panthers to just 55 in his first season with the Flames. And there was optimism heading into this season that maybe he'd be able to bounce back and get closer to being the player he was in 2021-22, a new head coach, a full season in Calgary under his belt. But unfortunately for the Flames, it was much of the same this season for Huberdeau. He just hasn't been able to be that game breaker for the Flames that he was for the Panthers. The Carolina Hurricanes are up next, and this is another easy one. It has to be Jesperi Kotkaniemi, still 6 more seasons at a cap hit of a little over 4.8 mil per. After putting up career highs across the board last season with 18 goals and 43 points, Kotkaniemi took a pretty big step back this season, saw his role diminished to average under 13 minutes of ice time per game, and Kotkaniemi did fine in that role as a 2-way bottom 6 center. He's decent in the face-off dot, but for a guy you're paying almost 5 mil per season for the next 6 years, you hope that there's another level that he can get to, and I definitely think there's still a world where Kotkaniemi could break out and become, that 50-plus point 2-way middle 6 center. He's only 23. It's easy to forget how young this guy is because he's played 6 full seasons in the NHL. I'm certainly not writing off Kotkaniemi by any means, but I do feel like right now his contract has to be the worst on the team, and hopefully for the Hurricanes' sake that changes in the next couple of years. Moving along now to the Chicago Blackhawks, my pick for their worst contract has to be Seth Jones. 6 more seasons at a cap hit of $9.5 million per. I will say, I don't think Seth Jones is anywhere close to being as bad as some people make him out to be. This is a guy who plays very tough minutes on a brutal Chicago Blackhawks team, and yet he's coming off of a pretty strong season with the Blackhawks. 31 points in 67 games. His underlying numbers look the best they've looked in quite some time. Don't get me wrong, probably not a guy I'd want on my favorite team's blue line at 9.5 mil per season, but I just don't really like how people act like Seth Jones is a net negative for the Blackhawks and he makes them worse. And, if he was traded, he would go to a team and make them worse, because that's just not true. Next up, we have the Colorado Avalanche, and my pick for their worst contract is going to be Miles Wood, who has 5 more seasons at a cap hit of 2.5 mil per. Miles Wood is a decent, speedy, forechecking 4th-line winger, scored some big goals for the Avalanche in the playoffs, but usually players like Miles Wood are not the kind of guys you give this sort of term to. 2.5 mil per season, not the end of the world, but for a team like Colorado who has, I think, a lot more good contracts than bad, I think Miles Woods does stand out as the worst. The Columbus Blue Jackets are up next, and my pick for their worst contract is going to be Elvis Merzlikins, who has 3 more years at a cap hit of $5.4 million per. After a disastrous 2022-23 season, Merzlikins did bounce back a little bit this season, performed much better, but still finished the year with a sub 900 save percentage. If you were to rank the starting goaltender from all 32 NHL teams, from 32 all the way to number 1, I feel like Merzlikins would definitely have to be towards the bottom of that list. He has his moments where he shines, but for the most part, really inconsistent. The Dallas Stars are up next, and my pick for their worst contract definitely has to be Tyler Seguin. 3 more years at a cap hit of $9.85 million per season. Still a really solid top 6 forward, a guy you can pencil in for 20 plus goals and 50 plus points in a season, but he's not someone who's going to be pushing 40 goals and up there around a point per game anymore. Seguin is the highest paid player on the Dallas Stars roster, but if you were to rank the players on that team, I would say this past season Seguin was probably at best the 5th or 6th best player. The Red Wings are up next. You could go a couple of different ways with this one. Honorable mentions to Justin Hall and Ben Sherratt, but for me, the worst contract on the team is going to be Andrew Kopp. 3 years left at a cap hit of $5.625 million per. This signing really just has aged very poorly for the Red Wings, and it looks even worse after signing someone like JT Compher, who I think did fine with the Red Wings this past season, kind of took over as the full-time number 2 center, bumped Andrew Kopp down to the 3rd line, and now the Red Wings are left with Andrew Kopp, making $5.6 million as a 3rd line center, and it's not like he's really thriving in that role either. Next up, we have the Oilers, and for their worst contract, I feel like it has to be Darnell Nurse. 6 more years at a cap hit of $9.25 million per season. This guy makes more than Cale Makar, which is pretty crazy to think about. I am going to say the same thing about Darnell Nurse, though, that I said about Seth Jones. I don't think Darnell Nurse is anywhere near as bad as some people are making him out to be. Sure, he had a real rough stretch in the playoffs, but this is a guy who over the last few seasons has consistently given the Oilers solid 2-way results while playing top pair minutes. He is a good player. Is he worth north of $9 million per season? No, of course not. He's not even the best defenseman on his team, but he's not the pylon that a lot of people are trying to make him out to be. Next up, we have the Florida Panthers, and this is a tough one for me because this is a team with a lot more good contracts than bad, so I feel like almost by default, it's got to be Sergei Bobrovsky, right? 2 more years left at a cap hit of $10 million per season, but it still almost feels criminal having him here as their worst contract, considering the fact that he was literally nominated for the Vezina Trophy this season and has now led his team to the Stanley Cup Finals in back-to-back years. But still, 2 more years at a $10 million cap hit for a 35-year-old goaltender is a lot, and really, if it's not Bobrovsky, I'm not really sure he would pick here because the Florida Panthers have a lot of bargain deals on that roster. The Los Angeles Kings are up next, and this is an easy one. It's got to be Pierre-Luc Dubois. 7 more seasons at a cap hit of $8.5 million per, and man, it was just a disastrous first year for Dubois as a member of the LA Kings. Played in all 82 games and finished the year with just 16 goals and 40 points, the second lowest points per game he's finished a season with in his career. There was a point in the season where he was called out by then head coach Todd McClellan. If Pierre-Luc Dubois doesn't bounce back in a big way next season, then this contract is quickly going to be looked at as one of the worst in the entire league. The Minnesota Wild are up next, and for their worst contract, I'm going to go with Freddie Gaudreau. 4 more years at a cap hit of $2.1 million per season. Gaudreau was actually pretty productive throughout his first 2 seasons with the Minnesota Wild. 44 points in 2021-22, 19 goals in 2022-23, earned himself this extension, and then this season, which was the first of the 5-year deal that he signed with the Minnesota Wild, his game fell off of a cliff. Finished with just 5 goals and 15 points, went from playing in almost a top 6 role to a 4th line role. Not only did his counting stats fall off of a cliff, but his analytics were very poor as well. Just didn't really have a whole lot going for him this past season, and the early returns on this extension are not great. Moving on now to the Montreal Canadiens, my pick for their worst contract is definitely going to be Josh Anderson, who has 3 more years signed at a cap hit of $5.5 million per season. One of the more fascinating players in the NHL, in my opinion, with his combination of, size and speed and his shot. This is a guy who should be a lock for 25 plus goals in a season, but he's just never really been able to find much consistency. You never know what you're going to get from him, from game to game. He's a little bit one-dimensional, so when he's not scoring goals, he's not really impacting the game in other areas either. And this past season, he was definitely not scoring goals. Finished with just 9 in 78 games, the lowest goal total he's put up in a full season in his entire career. My pick for the worst contract on the Nashville Predators is Luke Schenn. 2 more years at a cap hit of $2.75 million. Not anything crazy, but I think it is pretty pricey for a third pairing, hard-nosed physical defenseman. Not a guy who's going to eat a lot of minutes. Doesn't have much of an offensive game whatsoever, and his defensive analytics took took a bit of a hit this season as well. New Jersey is up next, and my pick for their worst contract definitely has to be Andre Palat, 3 more years at a cap hit of $6 million per season. Not a bad player by any means, still a fantastic defensive forward, but $6 million per season for the next 3 years for, a defensive specialist whose offensive game has already started to deteriorate is pretty pricey. Moving on now, next up we have the New York Islanders, and my pick for their worst contract is definitely going to be Jean-Gabriel Pageau, 2 more years at a cap hit of $5 million per season. I feel like this is a contract that everyone kind of knew wasn't going to age the greatest. Pageau back in 2019-20 had a career shooting year with the Senators, 24 goals in just 60 games before being dealt to the Islanders, and after signing this extension, Pageau was never able to hit the 20 goal mark again. Still a solid two-way third line center, but $5 million a season for a third line center I think is a bit much, especially for a team like the Islanders who have been, right up against the cap over the last couple of seasons. Next up we have the New York Rangers, and my pick for their worst contract is going to be Barclay Goodrow, 3 more years at a cap hit north of $3.6 million. I think you could give an honorable mention here to Jacob Trouba, but in my opinion, Jacob Trouba definitely brings a lot more to the table for the Rangers than Barclay Goodrow does. Goodrow really is nothing more than a physical fourth line forechecking forward. Obviously had a couple of really good playoff runs with the Tampa Bay Lightning, which led to him getting this contract from the Rangers, and his first 2 seasons with the Rangers weren't bad, double digits in goals, 30 plus points, but this season that offensive production kind of fell off of a cliff, finished with just 4 goals and 12 points in 80 games. Did have some big moments in the playoff run, scored 6 goals in 16 games, but if I'm being honest, I would not be surprised at all to see the New York Rangers try and get out from under this contract sooner rather than later. Moving along now, next up we have the Ottawa Senators, and my pick for their worst contract is definitely going to be Jonas Korpisalo, 4 more years at a cap hit of $4 million per season. Had a really rough first year with the Senators, 21, 26, and 4, a save percentage of just .890 and a negative 13.6 goals saved above expected. This is a contract that I was pretty skeptical about when Ottawa initially signed it because Jonas Korpisalo, prior to this past season, had never started 40 plus games in a season. He'd never been, a legit number 1 guy. I think everybody knew there was quite a bit of risk involved when the Senators signed Korpisalo to this deal, and it's only been 1 season, but it's not looking good so far. The Philadelphia Flyers are up next, and my pick for their worst contract is going to be Sean Couturier, 6 more seasons left at a cap hit of $7.75 million per season. Sean Couturier returned to the Philadelphia Flyers lineup this season after missing almost 2 full years, and I think he honestly did really well for how much time he missed. The finishing just really wasn't there, but still had really good underlying numbers. This is a guy who has always been a fantastic two-way center throughout his career, and even after missing those 2 years, he came back and was still very effective in terms of a 200-foot game. At 31 years old, missing the amount of time he missed, I do have my doubts if he's ever going to be able to get back to being, one of the very best two-way centermen in the league, Selke level defense and putting up 70 plus points. But even if he doesn't, this past season, it was nice to see him back on the ice, and he proved he can still be a very effective player, just maybe not a guy that's worth, $7.75 million a season anymore. The Pittsburgh Penguins are up next, and it's going to be Erik Karlsson, 3 more years left at a cap hit of $10 million per season. At 34 years old, Karlsson still a very effective offensive defenseman, and I think he had a really good first year with the Penguins. Finished with 56 points in 82 games, was averaging over 24 minutes of ice time per game. The Penguins had a lot of problems this past season, which led to them missing the playoffs once again, but Erik Karlsson was definitely not one of those problems because he did really well. But with that being said, $10 million per season is still a lot, so I think Karlsson is the worst contract on the Penguins, but that doesn't mean he's a bad player at all. The Sharks are up next. This is an easy one. It's got to be Marc-Edouard Vlasic, 2 more seasons at a cap hit of $7 million per. He's 37 years old, played 57 games with the Sharks this past season. He's playing sheltered minutes now at this point in his career, a career that has been fantastic. Obviously, back in the early 2010s, Marc-Edouard Vlasic was an absolute beast, and he's still a serviceable depth defenseman at this point in his career, but obviously not worth $7 million a season. Next up, we have the Seattle Kraken, and my pick for their worst contract is definitely going to be goaltender Philip Grubauer, who still has 3 more years left on his deal at a cap hit of $5.9 million per season. Philip Grubauer has finished each of his 3 seasons as a member of the Seattle Kraken with a sub 900 save percentage. He lost his starting role this season to Joey Daccord. Aside from that playoff run in 2023, Philip Grubauer's tenure with the Kraken so far has been pretty forgettable. Moving along now, next up we have the St. Louis Blues, and my pick for their worst contract is definitely going to be Torrey Krug, who still has 3 more seasons left at a cap hit of $6.5 million per. Torrey Krug is an offensive defenseman, a power play specialist who still puts up pretty respectable point totals at 39 this season in 77 games, but he's not a guy you want to play, tough matchup minutes at 5-on-5 because he does give quite a bit back defensively, and I do feel like $6.5 million for kind of, a one-dimensional all-offense defenseman is quite a bit, especially if they're not, lighting the world on fire with their offensive production. Next up, we have the Tampa Bay Lightning, signing, and I'm actually going to go with somebody who they recently acquired in a trade, Ryan McDonagh. 2 more seasons left at a cap of 6.75 mil. McDonagh is actually coming off of a very good season with the Predators, did really well for that team in a top 4 role, sort of revived his career a little bit after becoming a cap casualty for Tampa. He was traded to Nashville in a cap dump deal, and now just a couple of years later, Tampa reacquires him, and Nashville gets a second round draft pick. So tiny bit of business there for Nashville when it comes to, this whole Ryan McDonagh thing. Even though McDonagh did have a really good year with Nashville, I was kind of surprised to see Tampa Bay make this deal and take on his full salary because of their cap situation, because they have somebody like Steven Stamkos as a pending UFA, and I do feel like 6.75 mil for the next 2 years is a bit risky of a deal to take on for a team like Tampa Bay. In the situation that they're in, is McDonagh going to be able to replicate the success he had this past season with Nashville in Tampa? I guess we're going to have to wait and see. Next up, we have the Toronto Maple Leafs, and for their worst contract, I decided to go with John Tavares. 1 year left at 11 mil, so the fact there's only 1 year left bodes pretty well for Toronto. Now, John Tavares, still a very effective player, finished this past season with 29 goals and 65 points in 80 games, plays a strong two-way game. Obviously, he's a leader for this team, but at this point in his career, he's just not the kind of player that's worth $11 million a season. And I think when that money comes off the books next offseason, it's going to open up a ton of possibilities for the Maple Leafs. I do expect Tavares to probably extend in Toronto, but at a much, much lesser cap hit than 11 mil per season. Utah is up next, and this is kind of a tough one because they don't really have anyone signed, and the guys they do have signed, I don't think they're really bad contracts per se. So just by default, I guess I had to go with Lawson Krause. 3 more years left at 4.3 mil per season, but I don't really think that's a bad deal. I mean, this is a guy who just scored 20 plus goals for the 3rd consecutive year. He's fine defensively, isn't much of a playmaker, but he finishes plays, and that's valuable in the NHL. So with his kind of production, I don't think anyone in the Coyotes organization is probably upset with what they're paying him, but I mean, I had to pick somebody here, right? The Canucks are up next, and my pick for their worst contract is going to be Ilya Mikheyev. 2 more years left at a cap hit of 4.75 mil per. He is a speedy bottom 6 two-way winger who can chip in a little bit of offense, had 11 goals and 31 points this past season in 78 games. Definitely a useful player, but not really the kind of guy that you pay, almost 5 mil a season. Wouldn't be surprised at all to see Vancouver try and move on from him sometime this offseason. Moving along now, next up we have Vegas, and for their worst contract, I'm actually going to go with Alex Pietrangelo. 3 more years left at a cap hit of 8.8 mil per season. Pietrangelo's game definitely took a bit of a step back this season, especially defensively. Offensive production still solid, over a half point per game, but you gotta wonder now at 34 years old, is this kind of the start of the decline for Alex Pietrangelo? This is a guy who's got a lot of miles on that body. He's played a ton of minutes in his career. Still this past season was averaging over 23.5 minutes per game. I'm really interested to see what Vegas ends up doing with that decor. After bringing in Noah Hanifin and signing him to that extension, it's going to be pretty difficult to find the cap space to sign Shea Theodore to an extension, who's going to be a UFA next summer. It's kind of looking like they may have to end up choosing between Pietrangelo and Shea Theodore, and given the age of the two, you have to think they'd probably be leaning towards choosing Shea Theodore, but given the fact that Pietrangelo has a full no-move clause in his contract, Vegas might not really have a choice here. The Washington Capitals are up next, and for their worst contract, I definitely have to go with Tom Wilson. At 30 years old, he still has 7 years left at a cap hit of 6.5 mil. His offensive numbers took a pretty big hit this season, just 35 points in 74 games. That is the lowest points per game in a single season for Tom Wilson since the 2017-18 season. Obviously, Wilson is one of those guys who brings a lot of other things to the table other than offensive production. He's physical, tough to play against, plays a strong defensive game, but 6.5 mil per season is pretty rich for that kind of player, in my opinion, and having 7 years left on that deal, he's going to be 37 when the contract is up. You have to imagine this contract is probably just going to look worse and worse year after year. And now finally, finishing out today's video with the Winnipeg Jets, and my pick for their worst contract is going to be Nate Schmidt. 1 year left at a cap hit of 5.95 mil. Nate Schmidt is a guy who has seen his role change quite a bit since coming into Winnipeg. He was brought in as kind of, a top 4 smooth skating offensive puck moving defenseman, and then you look at this past season, Nate Schmidt played third pairing minutes in more of a shutdown role, and he did pretty well in that role defensively, but almost 6 mil for a third pairing shutdown guy is quite rich. Luckily for the Jets, though, only 1 year left on that contract, so it's really not that bad. Winnipeg's cap situation is pretty solid right now. So that is going to wrap up today's video, going over the worst contract from all 32 NHL teams. As always, I want to know your guys' thoughts, so if you disagree with any of my picks, be sure to let me know what your list would look like down below in the comments. If you guys enjoyed today's video and you want to see more one from every team videos in the future, be sure to leave this one a like. It is the best way to let me know that you enjoyed, and it does help out the videos a ton. And most importantly, if this was your first time checking out the channel and you want NHL content just like this all year round, hit that subscribe button, and I will talk to you all again soon.